Hello, and today's learning target is I can determine the slope and y-intercept from an equation written in slope-intercept form. Today we are going to be introducing something called slope-intercept form. This form is very handy and we will eventually learn how to graph from it. So many of the examples that we've gone through in class with this unit, all the equations have looked somewhat familiar, and that is purposeful because it's slope-intercept form, which now in this video we are going to learn a little bit more about. So in this equation, y equals mx plus b, m is the slope, and that should be nothing super new because when we've talked about slope the past few days, we know that slope is usually denoted with the letter m. B represents the y-intercept, and we'll talk more about what that means on a graph when we get into graphing from this type of equation. But for today, we know that B will represent the y-intercept in an equation. Now, let's identify the slope and y-intercept from the following problems. Now, when we look at an equation, the number in front of the variable x is the slope, and the constant, or the number that's not attached to any variable, is called the y-intercept. And when we label these problems, we will label with using the correct variables. So we'll say that m represents the slope, and b represents the y-intercept. So in this equation, the number that's in front of x is 4/3. So 4/3 is our slope. We are going to leave our slope written as we see it, not change any fractions to decimals, we're not going to change any improper fractions to mixed numbers. We are going to leave them as they are because they are probably already in the correct form. And then b here, the y-intercept, would be 2. All right, let's continue to go through a few more examples. Here, the number in front of x is -1/2. And the number that's not attached to any variables, usually written at the end of an equation, is 3. Okay, y equals 2x minus 5, m is 2, b is -5. Let's keep going. Y equals x minus 2. In front of x, it doesn't look like there's a number written, but we know really what is in front of x, a 1. So 1 would be our slope. B would be -2. Okay, now we see y equals x. Okay, we could actually change this equation to say y equals x plus 0 if that's then easier to determine the slope and the y-intercept that we want to find. So here in front of x, similar to the last problem that we did, since there's no number written in front, we really know that there's a 1 in front. Then b would equal 0. And since there was nothing even written there, we filled that in with a 0. We could have just, known that that was 0 instead of actually writing in a plus 0. But if it helps out to understand that the y-intercept would be 0 here, go ahead and fill that in like we just did with a 0. All right, y equals -3. We can think of this equation too because we don't see an x, right? So we have to still determine what the slope is. So we could think of this as y equals 0x minus 3. So now if it's easier to see clear, m would equal 0 and b would equal -3. Again, if the slope isn't written, like here there was no x variable, then it's just going to be 0, similar to the last example where we determined that the y-intercept was also 0 right there. So to recap, when we are given an equation in slope-intercept form and we want to determine the slope and y-intercept, the slope is the number that's in front of the variable x, and the y-intercept is the the constant number that's usually at the end of the equation that is not attached to any variable. Now we are going to practice writing equations in slope-intercept form when we are given the slope and the y-intercept. So different than what we just did on the last slide, but now we're going to put it all together and write this equation in slope-intercept form. So let's look at the first example. Given a slope of 5 and a y-intercept of -2, write an equation in slope-intercept form. So let's write down what we know. M is 5 and b is -2. Slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. So now if we fill in what we know, m is 5, I'm going to replace m with 5, and now I have y equals 5x, and then b is -2, so y equals 5x minus 2. That would be the equation in slope-intercept form with the slope of 5 and a y-intercept of -2. One thing to note on that problem is that we do not need to add a negative. So we know the equation in slope-intercept form is represented by y equals mx plus b. We don't need to put a plus a negative, and in fact we actually don't want to because that's not the proper way to really write that equation. All right, let's continue. Let's look at the second example. Write an equation for a linear line that has a slope of -1/2 and a y-intercept of 2. So my slope is -1/2, y-intercept of 2. In a linear line, again, slope-intercept form, what would be a straight line. So that is y equals mx plus b. So y equals -1/2 x plus 2. All right, let's keep going. Write a linear equation that has a slope of 0 and a y-intercept of 2. So let's go ahead and jot down what we know. We know m is 0 and b is 2. So into y equals mx plus b, I have y equals 0x plus 2. But really, when I see 0 times anything, that just goes away. So I don't even need to write that. My final equation will just be y equals 2. Okay, let's continue on. Write a linear equation that has a slope of 1 and a y-intercept of -2. So again, I'm going to jot down what I know. Into y equals mx plus b. So I have y equals 1x minus 2. But do I really have to write the 1x? Do I need to put a 1 in front of x? I don't, and in fact, it's better to not write that in front because typically, you won't ever see that. We know if we just see a single x that has really a coefficient of 1 in front. So we could just write y equals x minus 2. All right, in the last equation here, write a linear equation that has a slope of -3/4 and a y-intercept of 0. So it's going to be y equals -3/4 x plus 0. But similar to the last example, do I need to write a plus 0? I don't. Because it's 0, it's unneeded, or don't need to write that. So my equation is y equals -3/4 x. So again, to recap what we did on this part of the notes is we wrote an equation in slope-intercept form given a slope and a y-intercept. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.